they all go fine.
Both of them?
They all work out really well. I haven't ever had a problem.
Oh, okay.
You know?
So you're a newbie, is that what you're telling me?
No, I'm an old one that hasn't done it in 3 years. I did it for 7 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I said I know what I'm doing. It's just I'm getting my first
So
one.
one thing I'll have to ask you is to speak up.
Okay.
You may notice I'm wearing hearing aids.
I hadn't noticed. They look well.
You know, I have a hearing problem.
Okay.
So if you mumble, I'll have to ask you to repeat the question.
That's fine. Can you understand me with this tone?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Yep. You tell me. All right. Mr. Charles Petty, we are at the 12th Armored Division reunion, September 18th, 2004. I'm just going to go ahead and ask a couple questions from you and get started with where you were raised, what year you were born, and where you were raised.
I was born in 1924, November 26th, and I was born in Chicago. Don't remember that. Moved to Urbana, Illinois, where my father was a graduate student, and that's my first memories. We then moved to Minnesota, where he was a professor at a small college in Winona, Minnesota.
And do you have any siblings?
I have two siblings, yes. A sister and an older brother and a younger sister.
Good. Did you go to school, to college?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I went to Wabash College in Indiana, and from there I went to the Army, and came back after the war to finish up there at Wabash. I spent a year at Caltech in Pasadena. From there I went to work for the government in Washington, D.C. I continued my graduate work at Johns Hopkins, where I graduated in 1956.
That's great. What year was it that you went into the Army?
1943.
And where were you? You were in Kansas?
I beg your pardon?
Where were you when you entered the Army?
Well, I was a draftee. I had been 1 year at college. I was 18. And I was inducted at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, in Minneapolis. Basic training was in Camp Callan, California, Southern California.
What do you remember of Pearl Harbor? How did it impact you and your family?
Well, you know, it was a shock to everybody. My brother, my older brother, immediately signed up for the Air Force. I still had planned to go to college, and my draft board had a policy that if you enrolled in college, you could finish up that year. So I was excuse me, I was 18 in November of that year, so I continued on until the following summer. No, Pearl Harbor was a shock to everybody, I think, but we knew we were at war, and everybody was pretty much, all the young men at the time figured they would be called. So it was, it happened.
What was your, do you recall what your first experiences were like in the Army?
First experiences?
Yeah.
Well,
What did you think about it when you went into camp?
well, I don't know. It was a new experience, but you know, everybody was new in it, so we pretty well put up with it.
And what did
Yeah.
you train in?
Well, my basic training was in anti-aircraft artillery, 90 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, and that training continued for, I guess it was 18 weeks or something.
What do you remember about the United States going into combat theater?
Could you repeat that? What do I remember about the United States going into combat theater?
Mm-hmm. Just your trip going from the United States into England.
Well, okay, you're jumping ahead, I think.
Okay.
I was one of the ASTP
Oh, you were?
people.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I
So
apologize.
you want to skip over that?
No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. I wasn't aware. They didn't notify me that you were ASTP. Please
Oh.
tell me about your experience in ASTP.
Well, after basic training, they gave tests and chose a group of us to go to the ASTP program, which seemed like a good idea. So I spent most of my time in what they called a STAR unit, which was at Ontario, California, at a junior college there. And we studied various technical subjects, and we marched to class and all that. And so it was in January when I was assigned to the School of Mines in Socorro, New Mexico. And that didn't last long, though, because the whole program was canceled in March. So we were notified we were going to Camp Barkley.
Do you remember any of your professors and their impact?
Not really. I guess I can't say that I do.
And what was the name of the college in California? Do you remember that?
It was Chaffee Junior College in Ontario.
Okay. So where did you go from college? You went to Barkley. Camp Barkley?
To Camp Barkley, yes. Oh, yes. So I was assigned to the service company of the 17th. And I didn't go to a rifle company until just before the division went overseas. So I was really one of the late arrivals to the B Company of the 17th. That occurred, I think, about in September. So they assigned me to a rifle squad, and we were then on our way to the port of embarkation.
So do you remember your trip there? From
Not a whole lot. I mean, it was a troop train, you know, and it took several days to get there, but and then we were there for a few days, I think over a weekend, before we got on the Empress of Australia to to go. We were supposedly going to France, but I guess others have probably recounted that story, that the vehicles were commandeered while we were en route. George Patton needed some vehicles. D-Day had already occurred, of course, and they were charging across France. So we had to get new vehicles in England. So we put in at Liverpool, I believe, and then went to the tent city, Tidworth Barracks, I guess they call it.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there for a few weeks, I guess. I'm a little fuzzy on the dates, but we lived in tents there. Got used to the idea of blackout and that sort of thing. One of our first casualties, I remember, was one of our men who got run over by a half-track in the blackout. Somebody was backing up in the dark and didn't see that there was somebody in back, so he was killed before we even got to France.
So tell me about the buddies that you made during war.
Well, I was in a rifle squad, and we had I guess there were a dozen or so there. Our squad leader was a regular Army staff sergeant who was, I think he was in the cavalry originally. Mm-hmm. Ed Geppinger was one of my best buddies there. He was also an ASTP person. We had camaraderie amongst our squad and others in the company.
So tell me about your first experiences in combat, or your memories of combat.
Well, you're jumping ahead again.
Oh.
Do you? Okay. We went into combat on December 7th of 44, it was. And the password was round table. That was one of the things I remember. We'd never done passwords before. And we relieved an infantry group and spent the night in this little town. We were occupying a house there, and we could hear artillery fire, of course, which we'd never had experienced before. And I remember the next morning when dawn came, there were some dead soldiers in the vicinity that were still lying where they fell. So we moved ahead from that little town, and we were moving in with a tank company, and I think the engagement where Colonel Meigs was killed was a very famous encounter, and our platoon was very close to that vicinity. I mean, we all remember that event, and we were, under fire, and there was mortar rounds arriving, and several people were wounded and killed, actually. So we dug in for the night, and that tank was still burning all night long. So it was kind of a memorable experience. That was the first that I remember. That whole area where we moved into the Maginot Line region. Somewhat later, there was a night engagement in which we were going to move forward at night. Had never done that before, and what they did was put white tape on the back of the helmets, so that you were supposed to follow the person in front of you. And this turned out to be a fiasco, really, because part of the engagement was going over a fence. It was either a fence or a hedgerow or something. And so when people got over the fence, then they would run to try to find the one in front of them. Well, when you got over the fence and you looked around, you couldn't see the one, you know, he was far away, so we all ended up in different groups. We weren't with our squad, and I think I was even in a different company. And we were told to dig in at this advance. And when dawn broke, we were looking around, and there were these huge Maginot Line structures, you know, gigantic, kind of dome-like things that, you know, they could house all the troops in there and everything. And so this was kind of scary because we had no idea, you know, were there Germans inside these things or what? But fortunately they weren't. So that was another kind of a weird experience. So that was that first activity that I can remember.
Tell me about your experience with Herlesheim.
Well, Herlesheim, we were in a very large field on the 16th of January when I've learned since, we were headed toward Offendorf, which was the objective that day on the 16th. And the forest, the Steinwald forest was over to our right, and there obviously was a lot of activity going on over there. And we moved in with tanks, and that was apparently a kind of a shooting gallery for the Germans, who had some gun emplacements, and a lot of tanks were knocked out that afternoon. And we were also under artillery attack from ahead of us, and in fact you could actually see some of the rounds, you know, coming in your direction. And the ground was very hard. It was cold and, you know, very tough, so that the shells didn't kind of dig down into the ground. They just sort of exploded when they first hit. And I remember one of them that was a dud, thankfully, which hit, you know, maybe 20 feet or so in front, and it was kind of bouncing around like a football on the icy ground. And a long time afterwards, I saw the movie Schindler's List. I don't know if you remember how part of that told about some of these workers that Schindler had in an ammunition factory, and they were sabotaging the artillery rounds so that they wouldn't go off, and that kind of turned on a light bulb, and I thought, wow, I remember one of those that landed and didn't go off. But so that was that afternoon we we didn't get very far, and we were told to dig in for the night, and of course the ground was kind of difficult to dig into. I mean, your entrenching tool had to kind of get down through a foot or so of very hard, kind of rocky stuff, and then you could dig a pretty good foxhole. So we spent the night dug in there, and the next morning they said, you know, well, our new objective is going to be Herlesheim. So, and we don't expect a whole lot of opposition, but we're going to attack. They attacked, you know, kind of like at daybreak, and so we went in, and initially it was pretty easy going. There were a large number of Germans who surrendered right away in the outskirts of the town before, you know, just in front of the buildings. They had dug in a bunch of foxholes and essentially in a defensive position there. So, but this was apparently the kind of the home guard people, you know, older troops who decided they were going to surrender, and so there were substantial numbers who kind of came out, surrendered, and they were herded back to I forget the name of the town now. Wiersheim, I think, is where the rest of the. So we then proceeded into town, and we were going, you know, house by house, and then sometime, I don't know, it might have been midday or somewhere along the line, we realized that, you know, other German troops were arriving with tanks as well. They had, apparently there were Tiger tanks that were coming in, and I remember how quiet they were. They moved along and just kind of, you know, you heard this sort of a humming sound, and you could hear the treads kind of going clink, 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 because I guess they had Mercedes motors or something in them, so they were, compared to our tanks, which were unmistakable in their noisiness. But so we got part way into town, and then came nightfall, and it was kind of confusing. There were people, you know, who were holed up in houses, and one our squad was told to go on a night patrol to kind of find out essentially how far the Germans had penetrated into town. So our objective was to kind of go along the street in the dark and kind of see what we bumped into. So we went not too far before we did bump into to a German gun emplacement, and our platoon sergeant, Sergeant Curry, who was in charge of this patrol, was pretty quick on the uptake. He heard a password was passed from the German sentry, and they didn't use a procedure where they said halt and then asked for the password. They just kind of gave the password. Well, he just gave the same password back instead of having a countersign, you know, which is different from the password. He kind of pretended like, you know, he'd forgotten what the countersign was, and he gave the password. So that kind of apparently confused them. And our squad leader, Pierre Serval, used a little bit of German that he knew, and he said, "Kommen Sie her." And one of the Germans responded by walking partway across the street, and it was very dimly lighted. You know, there was, I don't know, maybe starlight or something. You couldn't see too closely, but he came across, and Pierre was ready to fire with his grease gun, and which is not a terribly reliable weapon, but he fired, and it only fired 3 shots. It was kind of a wham, 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 and then the gun jammed on him, and he hit this German, who retreated back across the street, and then the burp gun, which was up on the corner, let go at us, fired up, kind of up in the air. I remember it kind of hit the roof of a house down the street a ways, and so we decided it was time to get out of there. So reported back, you know, that this emplacement was where it was, which was very close to, you know, where. So I remember that encounter. Later, we heard that the command post, the CP for the battalion was surrounded, and they were planning a rescue mission. And so we were told that, you know, to expect that there would be people running out. Apparently the command post was right on the edge of town, and we were kind of in a field nearby, and that when they evacuated the command post, they would be running out, and we were supposed to be providing covering fire so that they could get out of there. And, you know, we were told, well, if somebody's running in your direction, you know, they're our guys, so don't shoot them, but just provide covering fire. So we were supposed to be waiting for that to happen, but sometime later they said that the command post had surrendered. So that mission was canceled, and our platoon leader, who then was Lieutenant Ebbage, I remember he very dramatically turned the battalion over to another platoon leader, Lieutenant Wayland, I believe was his name, and he said, "Take over the battalion." So Ebbage was going to report back, you know, the bad situation. And so we had apparently one lieutenant who was in charge of the battalion. And then shortly after that they told us that they were calling in artillery from, I suppose, up in the vicinity of Weiersheim. They were going to have an artillery barrage on Herlisheim. So we were instructed to find a secure spot, find a foxhole if you could. Well, I was lucky enough to find a very deep foxhole that the Germans had dug. I think it was one of the ones that these troops had surrendered from when we first entered that morning. And so I got into this foxhole, and it was quite deep, so that you could really crouch down into the bottom of it. And then this artillery barrage began, and you could, this was another very memorable, I don't know how long it went on, but it was just one salvo after the other. You could hear the guns firing, you know, in battery fire. Several guns would be going off with a certain pattern, and then not too long after you heard the shells whistling in the same cadence as the ones that were fired, and they just kept that up for, again, I don't remember how long, but I've heard that this is one of the biggest barrages that they had laid down, and it was quite an experience. So then when dawn broke, I kind of, you know, peeked out of the foxhole, and I saw 2 or 3 others who were retreating back in the direction of Weiersheim. So I thought that was the better part of valor, and I grabbed my gun and headed back, and in as much haste as I could muster. And after a while, I remember in the very distance there were some half-tracks who were coming to you know, to bring the stragglers back, and I was really afraid that they were going to leave before I got there, so I quickened my pace, tired as I was, and got back to a half-track, and they took us back to Weiersheim, and they put a bunch of us in an old schoolhouse, I remember, and there was just this great big, maybe it was a gymnasium or something, and most of us just kind of lay down there and went to sleep, because, you know, we hadn't really had a lot of sleep in the last couple of days. So I don't know how long I slept, but it was after that they were preparing for a counterattack from the Germans, and everybody was getting ready for that. And I think shortly after that we got relieved by another division, but that's my Herlisheim story.
That's
for
great.
what it's worth.
Yeah, that's great.
So next question.
Okay. What was your experience with the civilians?
Civilians? Oh, you mean in places where we were billeted and so forth? Yeah, they were generally pretty friendly experiences. I mean, when you consider that the procedure was basically to tell people, you know, we're going to move into your house and you get out of here, you know, we'll be here for a few days. And I think basically there was probably resentment naturally, but we didn't have any really bad experiences connected with civilians. And of course, the later on in the war, the so-called displaced persons, you know, there were a lot of people who were, you know, running away from the war. And I remember we caught up later on with some civilians which had been running away because apparently the Nazis had been telling the civilians that, you know, these were the awful Americans who were going to kill everybody, so that they better get out of there. And so there was this one woman I remember who came up to us and she looked at the group of us, you know, young kids, and she said, "You're just babies." She said, "They told us, you know, that you were these horrible people," and so that was an interesting comment. I thought, "You're just babies." And we were billeted at one house in Alsace where the people had a son who was in the German army, and they were very friendly to us, and they said it was their hope that their son would be able to surrender to the Americans and not get sent over to the Russian front. That was a great fear that they had. But so by and large, I would say we had pleasant encounters with civilians that we ran into.
What do you remember about the end of the war?
Well, I guess everybody was not wanting to be the last casualty in the war on the last day. Although I guess there were some in the 17th who were casualties toward the end, because this was down in southern Bavaria and into Austria, and there were some SS troops that were, you know, holdouts, and sniping was going on, and so we were concerned about having survived, you know, that 5 months. We figured we'd like to survive all the way through. There was a big German field hospital that was overtaken. I believe it was the town Rosenheim, and all of the local inhabitants were out standing by the curb as, you know, the vehicles rolled by, and the officers at the hospital were came out and kind of formally surrendered the hospital to the Americans, and it was a kind of a festive sort of thing. You know, everybody knew that it wasn't going to be long before the war was over. This was just a few days before. It's kind of an interesting sidelight. I have a neighbor later on back in Massachusetts, on a couple who lived just a few doors away who were little kids in Rosenheim. They had been evacuated from Munich because of the bombing there, and they remembered when the tanks rolled in, and they were standing by the curb there, and they came to America and became American citizens, and they were neighbors. So that was a kind of an interesting coincidence. But that was basically, I guess we ended up in Kufstein, which is in Austria, a couple days later. So that was a good feeling.
Tell me about your experiences in occupational duty.
Well, I got assigned as a, basically was kind of MP duty in Augsburg, which had been a totally bombed out city in Bavaria, and we were we had our quarters were in I think what was the old police headquarters or something, and we were kind of doing patrol work, and you know, we ride around in jeeps, and part of it was kind of being present at some of the trials that were going on. They were holding trials in which some Germans were accused of maybe possessing weapons or perhaps, you know, being collaborators or prison camp people or something. But these were military trials where they had some American officers who were presiding, and they. So I went to one or two of those, and we had our meals in the Ratskeller, which was down in the basement of the city hall, which had been all bombed out. But this was quite a posh place. You know, they had tables with tablecloths on the table, and they even had a little string quartet that was playing for the diners down there. So it was, and although it was GI food, apparently they had some German chefs in the kitchen who were making it sort of non-GI food. It was quite good, actually. So, and that was I was there for maybe just a couple weeks, but I didn't have enough points for an immediate discharge, and in fact the war in Japan wasn't over yet, so I was one who had chosen to go back to the States and then go on to Japan. So I was lucky in a way that I, you know, didn't have enough points, because I got on the boat in August after going to across Germany and France in the back of a GI truck to I think they call it Camp Lucky Strike in France, where we got on another boat to go back to the States. And so when the A-bombs were dropped, we were on the high seas heading back. So by the time we got to New York, it was, I think it was right on VJ Day when our boat put in at New York. So again, I was lucky that I got back sooner than a lot of them did, because I was sort of scheduled to go to the other theater. So basically, I guess that's my story. I knocked around for another 3 or 4 months waiting to get discharged. I ended up in Galveston, Texas, and was discharged in January of '46. So.
Did you have any experiences with concentration camps?
Actually, our company, got very close to the Landsberg concentration camp, but the group I was with, we didn't actually go in there. We did see a lot of the people who, the captives in the concentration camps were quite plentiful. They had these kind of prisoner uniforms, the striped uniforms, and so there were, many of those just kind of wandering around in those days. But no, I didn't go into any of the camps, and of course we heard about them after the war. It was being publicized at the time. Any more questions?
Yeah, let's just talk about your experiences after the war. You finished college?
Yes, I finished up at Wabash College. I went to summer school and managed to finish up in 1948, which was 2 years beyond what I would have finished up in. So then I think I mentioned I spent a year at Caltech, and then I got a job with the Navy in Washington, worked for the Naval Research Laboratory, and so one of the projects that I worked on at that time was had to do with the nuclear testing out in the Pacific, where they were testing the atomic bombs, and so I actually saw the first thermonuclear explosion out at Eniwetok, which was in 1951, and I left the government and went back for my PhD at Johns Hopkins afterwards. So.
Did you have a family?
Yes, I met my wife when I was working for the Navy in Washington, and we both went to Baltimore when I was in in graduate school there, and I got my PhD and she got her PhD, which was known as putting hubby through. So even though I still had some GI Bill coming in, she worked while I was a student. Our first child was born in Baltimore, and then we moved to Massachusetts after I got my degree, and we have 2 other children who were born afterwards.
Well, great. Our time's up, so I'm just going to end it here. I appreciate your time and your experiences. They will be very helpful.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.